A congressional investigation reveals that under Joe Biden's watch, government agencies have been pushing hard to silence independent news networks just like OAN. One America's Pearson Sharp has more.
Speaking truth to power has never been safe or easy, especially not when you're a small, family-owned news network and your only goal is to report the news, not make friends in high places by selling your airtime to sleazy DC swamp creatures. That means that from the very start, One America News has been in an uphill battle with the most powerful criminals in our country. The politicians on Capitol Hill. Crooks and cronyism run the show in Washington. And so we've made a lot of dangerous enemies along the way. Enemies working in a shadow government who from day one have never stopped trying to drag us off the air. The First Amendment means nothing to these wannabe dictators, and now we have proof that the most powerful rulers in our nation have One America News square in their sights, and they aren't stopping until we're gone. Thanks to an official investigation from the House Judiciary Committee led by the ever-vigilant chair, Jim Jordan, we know for a fact that government officials are targeting One America News using the vast resources of the United States government to illegally censor our reports. Why? Why would our elected officials violate the most sacred of amendments enshrined in the Constitution they are sworn to protect? It's simple, really, because they just didn't like what we're saying.
The Weaponization Subcommittee has come out with a report on censorship. Supposedly there is this organization called CISA, an agency within DHS. What is your interpretation of what was happening, sir?
Well, this is one more example of this administration using government, literally weaponizing your taxpayer dollars to silence conservative speech. The report lays it out in detail, and I really believe this is the beginning of us showing that this is not just an event here, an event there, or a rogue individual. This is a pattern of this administration to silence its opponents forever.
From any point of view, using the government to censor the media is a direct violation of the Constitution, a violation of the First Amendment, a violation of our civil rights, and a perfect example of how we're now living under a rogue, tyrannical, communist government. The House panel released a 103-page report detailing how a group called the Election Integrity Partnership, or EIP, was working directly with the Department of Homeland Security and the DHS's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency, known as CISA, to censor news and information online. Both of these agencies were coordinating with big tech like Google, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, and would flag content they didn't like, report it to their reps at Google, and have it removed, including our reports here at One America News.
My fellow conservatives, do we think that forcing big tech and big media to get into a room together to collude and agree on the terms under which news can appear on tech platforms, do we think that's going to result in anything good for our voices? Do we think that's going to ameliorate or eliminate censorship?
It's official. We don't have free speech in America anymore. We have government agencies determining what you are and aren't allowed to say. Now, it's important to mention that this group, the Election Integrity Partnership, was founded back in 2020, just before the election, by some of the most radical organizations in the world, including the George Soros-funded Atlantic Council. This is the same group, along with George Soros's Open Society, that was banned by the Russian government for being a security threat and because its activities posed a threat to the foundations of Russia's constitutional order and security. So now you know who's behind this group that decided to go after One America News. In fact, in a July of 2020 email, just after the EIP was created, a senior director at the Atlantic Council admits they created the Election Integrity Partnership at the request of the DHS. And we're having weekly conversations with U.S. government officials about disinformation.
There was something called the EIP, and that was a coordination entity, I gather, between a bunch of these different agencies. What sort of news outlets and individuals do you gather that they did censor?
Well, the conservative newspapers and so on, whenever they had an online presence, including their YouTube, that would be what would either be eliminated or, worse than that, sometimes throttled. And this is something that Chairman Jim Jordan has said for a long time. If you take someone down, they can complain. If you simply throttle them so very few people see what they've said, you've really hindered free speech in a very clever way. And we're seeing a lot of that in our investigation.
And that's exactly what's happening to our reports online. They were being throttled and shadow banned on platforms like YouTube and Twitter. The official staff investigation from the House concludes that, quote, the federal government and universities pressured social media companies to censor true information, like our reports here at One America News, as well as jokes and political opinions. Now you're not even allowed to have the wrong opinion. According to the report from the House committee, quote, this pressure was largely directed in a way that benefited one side of the political aisle. True information posted by Republicans and conservatives was labeled as misinformation, while false information posted by Democrats and liberals was unreported and untouched by the censors. And that's exactly what happened. Everyone from Donald Trump to One America News had their posts and content censored and silenced by agents working secretly in the federal government.
Well, one of the shocking things about our weaponization report, where the government worked with the universities to censor people, is I was on that list. Like, I am one of the people who was censored by our executive branch through these NGOs and through the universities back to the social media companies for spreading truthful things about natural immunity on social media. So that's disturbing to me. Think about that. You've got the executive branch censoring the legislative branch.
All of it for our protection. But Republican lawmakers weren't the only ones targeted. No, these communist voles came after anyone and everyone they could find, which included, quote, censoring any Americans engaged in core political speech in the lead up to the 2020 election. All part of controlling the narrative, making people think that everyone supported Joe Biden and the Democrats. And if you didn't, you were a fringe outlier and possibly a dangerous conspiracy theorist. The DHS acknowledged that because it couldn't publicly endorse a program promoting censorship, it opened the door for the Election Integrity Partnership to take over instead. Basically, this Democrat-led task force did what's known as switchboarding. That's where agents at CISA would flag users who were posting unapproved content online and then refer that content to the social media companies to deal with. Here's an email from Brian Scully, the head of misinformation at CISA, letting the Colorado Secretary of State know that he's flagged parody accounts on Twitter and asked Facebook to take down posts he considered misinformation. So you have government agents working with big tech, tattling on users who posted things they didn't like and asking social media companies to take down the posts. That's literally the definition of government censoring free speech. There's no other way to put it. CISA knew that this was technically illegal. So in their messages to Facebook and the rest, they made sure to claim these requests were voluntary. But they followed that disclaimer with another line warning that if the posts weren't removed, there was a pretty good chance they'd turn the matter over to law enforcement and intelligence agencies. You know, because posting memes about the election is a threat to national security. These images right here were flagged for disinformation by CISA and were censored online. You can't even tell jokes anymore. That's how bad it's gotten. But it goes even deeper. because Chris Krebs, the director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency and one of Trump's own appointees, actually hated President Trump and was actively working against him by helping to silence conservatives online, including us here at One America News.
CISA was actually directed by someone who was a Trump appointee. Do you find it ironic that this occurred in the Trump administration, essentially, sir?
You know, one of the successes of the Trump administration was policies. One of the failures of the Trump administration was to fill out all the positions so that they really knew what was going on. For example, the Department of Justice, plenty of things went on that were wrong, including the continuation of Russian collusion and so on during the Trump administration. It's a lesson for the next Republican administration. Get those people all the way down, get the political appointees watching the, if you will, the career people, the bureaucrats. Otherwise, you'll be cut from underneath, as President Trump was.
Listen for a second to this exchange between Alex Stamos, the head of the Election Integrity Partnership, the Soros-connected group targeting One America News, and Chris Krebs, as they discuss why freedom of the press is actually dangerous and scary.
People have so much choice now. They can choose what their news sources are. They can choose what influencers they want to follow. And they can try to seal out anything that helps them question that. And I think that gets to a really core issue with how our freedoms as Americans and the way we've treated press freedom in the past is being abused by these actors. In that we have given a lot of leeway, both in the traditional media and on social media, to people to have a very broad range of political views.
What they're saying, in case you missed it, is they think people have too many choices when it comes to what kind of news they watch. What Americans really need is a state-run news network with state-approved messaging that promotes the state's agenda and leaves Americans no other competitors or sources for their information. American Pravda, that's what's missing from this picture. Stalin would be proud. But of course, it gets worse.
There needs to be an intentional work by the social media companies collaborating together to work on violent extremism in the same way they worked on ISIS.
So now our reporting makes us violent extremists? Just to be clear, this is a man who works with the government to censor conservative media, claiming that networks like One America News are as bad as Muslim terrorists in the Islamic State. But this isn't shocking. This is just how our government views we the people. Remember that time when the former director of the CIA, Michael Hayden, claimed that conservatives are the most dangerous people in the world, even worse than Al-Qaeda? Hayden also happens to be on the board of the radical left-wing internet watchdog group NewsGuard, which has repeatedly targeted and censored One America News. Are you getting the picture as to why this is a problem?
We have to turn down the capability of these conservative influencers to reach these huge audiences. There are people on YouTube, for example, that have a larger audience than daytime CNN, and they are extremely radical and pushing extremely radical views. And then we're going to have to figure out the OANN and Newsmax problem. That these companies have freedom of speech, but I'm not sure we need Verizon, AT&T, Comcast, and such to be bringing them into tens of millions of homes.
Did you catch that? We are going to have to figure out the OAN problem. That's something you'd expect to hear from a Maoist dictator. They're literally talking about censoring our freedom of speech, acting like because we're allowed to air our reports, protected by our First Amendment rights, that somehow we are dangerous extremists who need to be silenced for the good of the country. Well, they didn't waste much time setting their plan into action. Stamos made those comments calling for AT&T and Verizon to drop One America News back in January of 2021. Around the same time, actual members of our government, Democrat Representatives Anna Eshoo and Jerry McNerney, sent a mafia-style letter to AT&T trying to strong-arm the cable provider into dropping One America News from their network. The government stooges falsely claimed that One America News has published misinformation and incendiary reports, and they demanded that OAN be shut down for public safety. And what do you know? A year later, that's exactly what AT&T did, dropping OAN from its lineup. 6 months later, Verizon followed suit and dropped us as well. And Verizon, it's worth mentioning, is one of the US tech giants, along with Google and Facebook and the rest, that met with US government agencies to push their goals of fighting election misinformation. Whether you agree with us or not, whether you're a liberal or a conservative, you must see the problem with the US government violating the Constitution to eliminate freedom of the press.
And most people in broadcast media would be horrified by that, and yet that's what was going on for years, particularly under the Biden administration. But even dating back to 9/11, a lot of this stuff has been welling up over time that the government thinks they have the right to police speech.
This was all part of a coordinated attack. And in November of 2020, just after the election, 4 US senators called on YouTube to crack down on any reports that raised questions about the 2020 election. Acting quickly, Democrats Mazie Hirono, Gary Peters, Amy Klobuchar, and the disgraced and corrupt Robert Menendez all conspired with big tech to have One America News banned from sharing our reports online. What you're looking at now is a letter written by these 4 left-wing radicals who somehow think they have the authority to force a private company to police the First Amendment. Sadly, it worked. And the same day their letter went out, YouTube did indeed ban One America News from uploading any new videos for a full week. After airing one of my reports on the China virus, where I interviewed an actual doctor who called hydroxychloroquine a cure for the virus, YouTube gave us a strike and demonetized our channel for spreading dangerous misinformation. Never mind that the information came directly from a doctor or that it's been repeatedly proven true. We've been demonetized ever since, and in May this year, we reapplied to have our channel unblocked after waiting 3 months to hear back from YouTube. Not only did they deny our application, but they managed to hit us with even more violations. Oddly enough, as far as I'm aware, YouTube still hasn't flagged any accounts that claimed the vaccines were safe and effective, or banned anyone who boasted that if you get vaccinated, you won't get sick and you won't die.
If you're vaccinated, you're not going to be hospitalized, you're not going to be in an ICU unit, and you're not going to die.
Of course, that's not true, but we all know YouTube isn't going to censor the White House. After all, that's who they work for. But the point is clear. The government, working together with big tech, is effectively crushing the freedom of the press.
I think there's a clear pattern of censorship, and it reveals the political leanings of those who are censored versus those doing the censoring. And I think that's evident, and I think it's self-evident that the arbitrary censorship role of big tech has led to partisan outcomes. And the same holds true with fact checkers when they collude with other interests.
All of this is agenda-driven. We are being systematically and methodically silenced. They can't technically stop us from reporting the news. They can just make sure that no one hears us when we do. In October of 2020, just weeks before the election, the EIP called out another one of our reports that was shared in a tweet with someone at the organization claiming, quote, "We have not seen a fact check on this direct story, but this story is targeted at discrediting the validity of vote by mail." Here is the problematic report with the headline, "Reports claim 440,000 questionable ballots sent to deceased or inactive voters in California." Now let's play a game. See if you can spot the difference between our report and this report from CBS. Group claims nearly 400,000 California ballots sent to people who moved out of the state or died. Can you tell the difference? Probably not, because they're the same story with almost the exact same headline. The only difference is that our report got censored by the Election Integrity Partnership, and the one from CBS Now, the EIP and CISA claim their goal is to target misinformation. So if that story was inaccurate, why didn't they flag the report from CBS as well? That incident led to my own report about the same topic getting censored on YouTube, despite showing actual evidence from our own employees. On Wednesday, One America News released a report exposing the dangers of voting fraud and cited numerous examples demonstrating that fraudulent voting can and does happen. Some of those examples come from our own employees who have personally received multiple ballots delivered to their homes. But none of that seems to matter to YouTube, and after reviewing our report, they promptly censored it. After achieving some 14,000 views, YouTube swooped in and muted the video's audio, making it impossible for anyone to understand what was happening in the report. Also, the video now features this warning at the bottom, an apparent attempt from YouTube to fact-check the report, insisting that all valid votes are counted in every election regardless of how they are cast. But that kind of censorship is par for the course. After all, in 2021, Biden's senior White House director of digital strategy, Rob Flaherty, told YouTube officials he wanted to have bi-weekly meetings to eliminate borderline content. Clearly, this qualifies. And now, thanks to a lawsuit out of Missouri, we know the fascist federal government colluded with big tech specifically to censor our reports here at One America News. In fact, OAN was right at the top of a list put together by CISA, a federal government agency run by the Trump-hating Chris Krebs. This covert list, created by our government, was given to social media companies like YouTube for the purpose of censoring and silencing our news reports. This all came to light in July of 2023 when attorneys general in Missouri and Louisiana charged the government with creating a federal censorship enterprise. Their words, to remove any speech the government or the CDC or unnamed voting machine companies didn't like about the pandemic or the elections.
There's a trial going on called Missouri versus Biden, where the government's being sued. Department of Homeland Security under Mayorkas and also the FBI under Wray are being sued for meeting with Twitter and Facebook and compelling them or coercing them to take down speech off of their platforms.
After reviewing the evidence, federal judge Terry A. Dowdy agreed and actually blocked Biden and his cronies from collaborating with social media companies to censor free speech, accusing Biden of trying to establish an Orwellian ministry of truth. Plaintiffs in the case made an incredible statement to the court. I'll read it now. This injunction put a stop to an egregious campaign lasting over 5 years, during which senior federal officials, using coercion, threats, deception, pressure, and collusion, insinuated themselves into the content moderation decisions of social media platforms to silence disfavored viewpoints. This campaign of federal censorship was so effective that it fundamentally distorted online discourse in America on great social and political questions, rendering entire viewpoints virtually unspeakable on social media. And we know all of that is true. It's still happening to us. According to official documents cited by the judge, the government was constantly working to deplatform and censor users online, while federal employees wielded great power over the social media companies, even demanding their compliance in taking down posts the government didn't like.
We have the testimony in Missouri versus Biden where they're saying things from the administration. They're saying, well, we might want to break your company up if you don't comply, or we might want to look at removing your liability protection if you don't comply. So there were really threats being made, and the judge said he thought it was one of the worst affronts to the First Amendment in our history.
This is a complete violation of the Constitution, our First Amendment, and is unquestionably illegal. But when has that ever stopped them? This kind of censorship directly affected independent news organizations like us here at One America News, where we had our content censored, our posts banned, and were demonetized and deplatformed not by social media, but by the United States government itself. Remember, this isn't us saying this. You can claim we're biased or call us conspiracy theorists, but this is coming from state attorneys general and a federal judge. In fact, thanks to the shakeup at Twitter, we also know the FBI had a direct line to all the big tech platforms, with executives at Twitter and Facebook actually meeting with federal agencies to help cover up news stories that were damaging to Democrats, like the Hunter Biden laptop, or Joe's disaster in Afghanistan, or the fake war in Ukraine, or literally anything that's happened since 2016. But that's not all, because the FBI was given the ability to directly report and delete tweets it didn't like. In fact, senior executives at Twitter and Facebook would actually meet with the FBI specifically to discuss censoring content they didn't approve of, including posts from the President of the United States. And not just the FBI, agents from the Department of Homeland Security and the Director of National Intelligence were also meeting with Twitter executives to actively manage and control content on the platform.
But it's the punishments on government, not on the social media platform, because ultimately, while I don't like it when YouTube has censored me or taken my speeches down, I don't really have a cause of action. They are a private company and they can post what they want to post. However, I do have, as a citizen and as a member of the government, the right to regulate government. So I think we can regulate government's interaction with the media, whether it's the legacy media, whether it's internet media. There's no reason the FBI or the Department of Homeland Security or this agency, CISA, should be sitting down. Just the meetings is chilling on speech.
Worse still, when actual government officials, Republicans of course, reported real-life, documented issues with election integrity, like the fact that 25% of mail-in ballots were being rejected for errors. The FBI had Twitter censor the posts and cover them up. Twitter execs even admitted they blocked the story about Hunter Biden and then lied about it to save Joe Biden's reputation just before the 2020 election. Imagine how differently the election would have gone down if people had known who they were really voting for. Of course, it wasn't just big tech getting in bed with the government. Our prestigious universities were also rolling over for creepy Uncle Sam. We have proof from the House Judiciary Committee's report that students from the University of Stanford were working at both CISA, the DHS, and the Election Integrity Partnership at the same time. Why is that important? Because it's a conflict of interest. It proves the government was collaborating with private organizations to censor free speech and that they're using our universities to help them. Another culprit in this conspiracy to shred the Bill of Rights is an agency from the State Department called the Global Engagement Center. According to the House report, the GEC was being used to directly censor American speech online. It's so bad, Elon Musk called it the worst offender in U.S. government censorship and media manipulation. The report explains the GEC regularly flagged content to social media platforms that included Americans engaged in constitutionally protected speech. And thanks to this report and some patriotic members of Congress, we now know that includes us here at One America News.
We had a hearing with the Global Engagement Center yesterday, the GEC as it's known. They're supposed to only work with looking at disinformation abroad as it affects America and our allies. But we know that they've worked directly with third-party organizations to discredit groups like The Blaze, Newsmax, One America. Real Clear Politics is saying these are the least credible. And then they go out there and they've supported organizations such as the New York Times and the Associated Press and the Huffington Post, saying they're the most credible. These were entities that were perpetuating the lie of the Gaza hospital bombing. So that's the kind of thing also, government funding entities that are slashing against American journalists that are doing real reporting and boosting up journalists that are doing fake reporting.
Another case of big tech colluding with our government against OAN involves Microsoft promoting blacklists that block conservative news organizations from getting any ad revenue. An operation funded by our tax dollars, of course. According to the Global Disinformation Index, another George Soros-backed think tank in England, One America News is one of the top 10 riskiest news sites on the internet, guilty of spreading disinformation. That's right, our website was part of a secret blacklist used to censor conservative news organizations to choke off their advertising revenue. Naturally, the GDI also published a list of the 10 most trusted news sites, and it's a who's who of the most demented leftist propaganda sites you can imagine, including BuzzFeed, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and NPR. It's worth pointing out that all of these most trusted websites shamelessly peddle the totally fake and disproven story about President Trump's Russian collusion. OAN, along with 37 other websites, was categorized as false or misleading, a rating that was then shared with advertisers who were discouraged from doing business with us. An insider in one of the ad agencies that relied on Microsoft's GDI report revealed that networks like One America News were financially punished. That's the term they used, just for publishing our reports. But they didn't just blacklist us. The Global Disinformation Index marked content on OAN as, quote, morally reprehensible and patently offensive with no redeeming social value. Laying it on a little thick, don't you think? What's more, this state-sponsored censorship was being bankrolled with our tax dollars thanks to the National Endowment for Democracy and, of course, our old friends at the Global Engagement Center. In fact, some $330,000 of our tax dollars went to this globalist effort to shred the First Amendment, and we never had any say about it. The bottom line is that this is nothing less than radicalized censorship, authorized, sanctioned, and supported by our own government. The problem, clearly, is that it's not the government's job to tell the American people what content they should watch, or pick and choose what programs networks should carry. That's the kind of thing that happens in communist China or in North Korea, not here in the United States of America. I don't know how to make this clearer. Our own government has been targeting us, the press, to censor our reports because they didn't agree with what we were saying. If that doesn't terrify you, then you have no grasp of history or the consequences of what happens when a tyrannical government turns on its people. But if this continues, you will.
There is no example in history of free speech being suppressed and anything good coming out. Almost always death comes out of it. Almost always. Because if you really are that bad as to be worthy of not being allowed to speak, I'm not sure they think we're really allowed ultimately to live. That's what it leads to. Today we suppress your speech, but if you keep speaking, we'll suppress you. I have no doubt that that's what it could lead to. No doubt whatsoever.
The point of this report isn't just about how One America News is being censored. The story is much bigger than that. Yes, that is happening, and yes, it's being carried out by our own government, illegally. But the story here is that all freedom of the press is critical to our republic. When one company, or even one person, is silenced, we are all silenced because our government has no business policing the airwaves for disinformation. It says right in the Constitution that Congress shall make no law restricting the press or the rights of individuals to speak freely. But as we've seen, Congress doesn't even have to make laws restricting our freedoms. They can just work directly with the media companies to interpret and selectively enforce the laws that suit their agendas. The very people sworn to protect our sacred Constitution are using it as a shield to hide behind their crimes. We must act now and hold these traitors accountable while there's still a Constitution left to defend and while we still have a voice to defend it. For One America News, I'm Pearson Sharp. For all our viewers asking where One America News is heading in the future, we would like to introduce you to OAN Live. OAN Live is the best way to stay up to date on all of the hard-hitting, straight-shooting, national and international headlines. And the best part is, OAN Live is only $4.99 per month. All the credible, honest, unbiased reporting One America News offers at a fraction of the cost of cable. Just go to OANN.com to easily sign up for OAN Live and stay informed.